Good morning, everyone. And I know what you're thinking. Great, Tim's back. Now, we're going to do a little bit of review, but I am going to do something a little bit different. And but anyway, let's start and go over our 17 periods real quick. I'm sure you all remember them. If you have any cheat sheets, put them down. No, I'm just kidding. Now let's go through them here. Before the flood, divided kingdom, captivity, silence, life of Christ, early church, letters to the Christian. Great. Hey, don't worry about it. It's great. Catching you quick off guard and off the cuff. If you ask me to say these, on a Monday morning when I'm starting to work, I'll be deer in the headlights as well. But yeah, I think we're getting them really well. And what I want to do this morning is actually do something it's not verbatim of what Bob did, but it's really close to it. I have modified it some. But this is essentially one of the lessons that Bob Waldron did. And what it does is it walks us through. It tells the Bible story. It tells the story. Maybe in a sense like you would tell your children or grandchildren. Maybe we'd simplify it some for them. But this is exactly this is the story. This is the Bible narrative, the history that we want to know, to have in our minds as we study through all of our classes for the next 3 or 4 years, right? So now this is not exhaustive. This particular lesson goes through the life of Christ, but I still think it's valuable. Have I got control of this? There it is. Thank you. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God brooded upon the face of the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw the light that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. In the days that followed, God completely created and organized the world. He prepared a garden that was east of Eden. It was watered by a river that parted in the 4 branches. And in this garden he made every kind of tree grow that was good for food. He made from the dust from the dust of the earth a man, and he breathed into his nostrils the breath of his life, and this man became a living soul. And because he was made from the ground, he was called Adam. Adam and God brought all the animals before Adam to see what he would call them. But among all these animals there was not a mate found, there was not a counterpart found for Adam, and therefore God put Adam to sleep. And he took out of his side a rib with the flesh thereof, and from that God, by his miraculous power, fashioned a woman, and he brought her to Adam. And Adam said, "This is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken from man." And he also gave her the name Eve, because she would be the mother of all living. They lived in the Garden of Eden, where every need and every want was satisfied for them. But there was a tree in the garden that God had said, "You are not to eat of this tree." One tree. God said, "Thou shalt not eat of the fruit of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, because in the day that you eat thereof you shall die." And for a time Adam and Eve lived in that garden, choosing not to eat of that tree. But one day Eve was beguiled by the devil in the form of the serpent. the most subtle of all the beasts of the field. And he came to her, and he beguiled her, saying, Yea, hath God said, You are not to eat of any of the trees of the garden? And she said, We may eat of all of the trees of the garden except for one, the tree which is in the midst of the garden. God has said, We are not to eat of it. For in the day that we do, we shall surely die. The devil said, You shall not surely die. God knows that in the day that you eat of that fruit, you shall be as God, knowing both good and evil. And so, as Eve looked at that fruit, it looked like it would taste good. It was beautiful fruit, and to think of eating it, and she would know as much as God about good and evil. So she put her hand out and ate of the fruit and gave it to her husband with her, and he ate of it. And sin and guilt and shame and fear and death all came upon them. They were separated from God because that wonderful relationship they had had with him like children in their father was destroyed, because when God came looking for them the next visit, they were hiding from God. And he said, Where are you, Adam? And he said, I'm hiding because I was naked. And God said, Who told you that you were naked? And who has brought this to your attention? What has made you conscious of this? Have you eaten of the fruit that I told you not to eat of? And Adam said that the woman you gave to me, she gave it to me, and I ate. And God said to eat, What is this? And God said, What is this that you have done? And she said, the serpent to Eve, What is this that you have done? And she said that the serpent beguiled me. And so God talked with each one of these. He talked with the serpent, who was Satan. He talked with the woman, and he talked with the man, and placed certain consequences on what they had all done. And one of the most significant things that happened here is that God said to Satan, I will put enmity between you and the woman, between your seed and her seed. He will bruise your head, and you will bruise his heel. And God said that from this time forward, man would not live indefinitely. Physical death would come to all upon the face of the earth. And God drove Adam and Eve out of the garden and would not let them live in paradise any longer. Paradise was over. Paradise was lost. And he placed the cherubim with a flaming sword at the entrance of the garden to bar their way to the tree of life. The tree of life would not be available to men on earth anymore. But God did not forget the men. He did not abandon them. He did not reject them. And as the years went by, God observed men seeking to bring his plan to pass. But instead of men drawing closer to God, they became more and more wicked as the years went by. And the population of the earth grew, and as it grew, it also became more wicked, and therefore God was very displeased and unhappy with the way things were turning out. And he decided that he would take a hand in the things and make a course correction. So he decided that he would purge the earth and start over again. But as he considered this, he beheld a man who was upright in everything he did, Noah. And so God said to Noah, I am bringing a flood upon the face of the earth, and I'm going to destroy everything in it whose nostrils is the breath of life. Now therefore you are to build a huge box, an ark. Build it of gopher wood. He told him how big to build it. It was a very large box. It was to be much higher even than this building, much longer. It was a huge thing. And God said, now I'm going to cause the rain to come. I'm going to cause the flood to be upon the earth, and I will destroy everything in whose nostrils is the breath of life. Noah completed his preparations, and he got on board. He got the animals on board that God had commanded him, and along with everything to sustain them that they would need. And God caused the rain to come down, and he opened the fountains of the deep. The waters rose upon the face of the earth until they covered even the highest mountains, and they rose 15 cubits above the highest mountains. And the ark floated upon the face of the waters, and all life in whose nostrils where the breath of life perished. And when about a year was gone, the earth was dry once again, and the ark had settled on Mount Ararat. And Noah and his family got out of the ark, and they built an altar, and they worshiped God. These 8 people were going to do things right as the years went by. Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their descendants. They moved down out of the mountains where Ararat was, and they came down into the valley, which is called the Mesopotamian Valley. They followed the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, and they made their way down, still functioning as one family, one people, although much grown in population until they come to a place called the Plains of Shinar. The Plains of Shinar would have been located not far northwest of the Persian Gulf, and it was located between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. And they came there to this plain, and they began to build themselves a tower, saying, "Let us build ourselves a tower whose top will reach to the heavens, and we will make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered upon the face of the earth." But God had said he wanted them to scatter upon the face of the earth. So he said, now nothing will be held from them, and therefore he came down to frustrate their plans. And he did that by smiting their languages. He divided their languages of man. Before this, all were speaking the same language. And this was the origin of the very ancient languages of the earth. This is not what we would consider French and German and Spanish and all of these languages. These were ancient, archaic languages that came into being at the time of the Tower of Babel. They were far older, and we don't even know for sure what those languages were, and certainly not what the original languages were. But when this happened, the population of the earth spread out, and the families grouped themselves according to what language they spoke, and they moved to the north, to the south, to the east, to the west. And hundreds of years went by, and many hundreds of years went by, long enough for these family groups to move away and settle down in areas like Egypt and up in Asia Minor and out in the eastern part of Asia and so on, east of where they were, and they had to develop civilizations. And so all of these things took a long time, but God's purpose was before him. So around 2000 BC, there was a great city that was built on that city had already been there, but there was a city on the banks of the Euphrates River. The city's name was Ur. It was populated by idolaters for the most part, but there was a man who lived there by the name of Abraham. Later on, his name would be called Abraham. And God spoke to Abraham and said, "Abraham, I want you to get up and I want you to leave your country, leave your father's house, leave your kindred, leave this land, and go to a land that I will show you." So Abraham rose up and he went forward, and God told him that he would make of him a great nation, and that he would bless all the families of the earth through him. And so Abraham rose up and did just as God said. And when he started out, he didn't know where he was going. God led him. And eventually Abraham came to the land of Canaan. And he came to this land, and the first thing he did was he built an altar so that he could worship God. And there God appeared to him. The city was Shechem in the land of Canaan, that God had appeared to Abraham, and he said, I'm going to give all of this land, all of the land that you see around you, I will give to your descendants. So there were 3 promises that God made to Abraham. I will make of you a great nation. I will bless all the families of the earth through your descendants. And I will give this land that you see here, the land of Canaan, I will give it to your descendants after you. For 100 years Abraham lived in that land, and he was 75 when he left his home, and he lived in this land for 100 years. And during the years he lived there, he did not own any land except what he bought. In other words, he was a man who had expectations, who had promises, but he never saw them. He never actually received those things. But for 100 years he lived in this land, believing that God would do what he said. And not only Abraham, but his followers, Isaac his son, his grandson Jacob, the three great patriarchs. They all lived in that land, and with each one, God would repeat that promise, that he would give this land to their descendants, that he would make of them a great nation, that he would bless all the families of the earth through his seed. And they all lived there by faith, knowing that this was not ultimately where they were going. They were looking for a city which had foundations, whose builder and maker is God, that they could have gone back to the country from which they had come, but they did not, because they sought for a better country. Yes, Abraham was a man who believed in God, and there were tremendous obstacles to his faith in God. But finally, the son of promise came, Isaac. And it was when God called on Abraham to offer that son that the greatest test of Abraham's faith came. When it seemed that everything was all settled now, all the questions are answered, all the pieces to the puzzle are in place, at that point God says to Abraham, "Get up, take your son Isaac, your only son, the son that you love, and go to the land of Moriah. And there on that mountain I will show you, you are to offer him to me as a burnt sacrifice." The faith of Abraham did not fail. Abraham proceeded to do as God ordered him to do. And what Abraham was thinking, that God is able to raise him up, even from the dead, even from the ashes of a burnt sacrifice. But of course, when Abraham got to the place and had Isaac all prepared to offer him up as a burnt offering, he took the knife in his hand. And God told Abraham, Abraham said, I'm here. Do not do any harm to the lad. Now I know that you fear me above all else, because you would withhold nothing at all from me. And this is why Abraham's faith is held up before us in the Bible as a mountaintop of faith. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all exercised that kind of faith. And in the days of Jacob, the foundation of the tribes of Israel was laid, because he had 12 sons. And these sons became the tribes of Israel. And in the story of Joseph, we learn how the family moved down into the land of Egypt. And they were saved by God from famine, and they were also saved from being absorbed into the Canaanite idolatrous population. But as the years went by, Israel became slaves. They fell into idolatry, and after a certain amount of time, when God's time was right, he remembered his covenant that he had made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He remembered the promises he had made, and he also heard the groanings of the children of Israel. So he raised up Moses to go down and lead the people out of the land of Egypt. So Moses came along, born under the sentence of death, preserved by the providence of God. And at the age of 40, he goes out, and single-handedly, he's going to save Israel. Well, he fails miserably and is rejected by Israel. But God made him ruler, even with his will, even rejected at the first. At the age of 80, he goes back and he leads Israel out of the land of Egypt. And they commit themselves under his leadership. When they come to the Red Sea and God divides the waters of the Red Sea, they cross over under Moses' leadership. And God is upholding Moses as the lawgiver. And as God's leader, he's upholding him out when they cross over. And God allows the waters to come back together, and they destroyed the Egyptian army. The whole Egyptian army is destroyed, and Israel makes their way on down the Sinai Peninsula, and they come to Mount Sinai. And God makes a covenant with his people there. He makes a covenant with Israel. He says, I'm calling upon you to be my holy nation. This is the nation he wanted of Abraham's descendants. He calls upon Israel to be this holy nation. And he gives them the law of Moses. They build a tabernacle, which is to be a reminder, a physical reminder, that God dwells among them all the time. And they were given the priesthood to offer up sacrifices of the people. So leaving soon, they made their way on up the land, and they were ready to go in and take the land, but they were afraid, as men are often afraid. They were afraid, and they did not have enough faith in God, and therefore they refused to go up and take the land. And they were sentenced to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And that generation of men of war died, and a new generation came along. And this generation was the generation led by Joshua. And they crossed over the Jordan River. And they took the land, they conquered the land, and they came up on the east side first. And though that previous generation had been terrified of the giants and the walled cities, now they took the walled cities and they conquered the giants. And so they conquered the kingdoms of Sihon, the kingdom of Og, and they possessed the east side under Joshua. And they go over, and Moses dies before they enter the land. And under Joshua, they go over and they conquer the enemy on the west side. All of Canaan is there. And the Bible says that the whole land that Joshua has conquered, Joshua and Israel has conquered the whole land, and they divided us as God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He would give the land to their descendants, and he has done just that. And here they are in the land, but they have been told, if you are to abide in the land, you must be sure that you follow the law of God, and do not depart from this law. If you do, then you will be cast out of this land as the inhabitants before you were cast out. Well, as the years went by, Israel was not faithful, and during the time of the judges, again and again, they wouldn't fall into idolatry, and God would, they would repent and they would cry out, and God would save them. He would raise up a judge to deliver them. And so Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, Abimelech, Tola, Jer, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, Samson, Eli, Samuel, these were the judges. And the last judge, Samuel, in his days. In his days, we come to the transition from the time of the judges to the time of the monarchy, to the time of the kings. Because Israel says in the days of Samuel, they come to him and they say, you're getting old and your sons do not walk in your ways. We want a king to be like all the nations around. Give us a king, Samuel. He was upset thinking that he had been rejected, but God said, no, Samuel, it is not you that they are rejecting, it is me. So give them a king. Tell them the way that the king will do, the way he will go. Tell them the manner of the king. But then give them the king as they insist. And so they received their first king, Saul. Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin, and yet even before Jacob had died hundreds of years earlier, he had made the statement in Genesis 49:10 that the scepter, the ruling sign of the king, shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until Shiloh comes. And unto him shall the obedience of the peoples be. This first king was Saul. But Saul was not a man that ruled the way that God wanted him to. He was not a man after God's own heart. And therefore God rejected Saul, and he raised up another king. And this king was David, and David was of Judah. And it was to David that God made the promise that links back with the statement in Genesis 49:10, because today that God says, David, because the king of king you are, I am making you a promise that the day is going to come when I will establish your son upon your throne, and he will reign forever. And this promise that God made, that David echoed a generation later in the 89th Psalm, when the writer of that psalm said that of his kingdom there would be no end, and that it would be in the days of the sun and as the days of the moon and during the time of David. David was a man after God's own heart, a mortal man, a man who was not perfect, but yet among men he was one of the best men that ever lived. And of the Spirit of God was upon David strongly. And David wrote about half of the Psalms. And in those Psalms he wrote many of the wondrous things regarding someone who was coming. And of this someone who was coming, he's been coming in the Bible record since we read in Genesis 3:15, as the seated woman who would bruise the head of Satan. He's been on his way. He's been on his way since Abraham, that the seed of Abraham that was going to be the one through whom all the nations of the earth would be blessed. And David wrote of him also, and he talked about him as one that God was going to set up. He talked about him as the one in whom the subjection of the earth would be absolutely completed. In Psalm 8, he talked about this one as the one that would not seek corruption, that he would not seek corruption because his soul would not be left in Hades. In Psalm 16, verse 10, this is the one whose hands would be pierced. Psalm 22, and so David wrote a great deal about this one who would be his descendant. He would be the anointed one, the Messiah, the Christ. And as we go through the years after David, Solomon ruled. But then after that, his kingdom fell apart because Solomon did not serve the Lord faithfully. And so after that reign of those three kings, about 120 years, then the kingdom divided into the north called Israel and the south called Judah. And these two kings, the kingdoms existed together for about 200 years. And during the time of these kingdoms, the written prophets started appearing, the earliest of them being Obadiah and Joel, and then coming along to Jonah and Amos, and in the end, Hosea. In Isaiah and Micah, these prophets wrote of wondrous things that go with Genesis 3:15, that go with Genesis 49:10, that go with Genesis 12:1 through 3 and 7, and that go with all of these other passages that we've been looking at. Isaiah was a great prophet who lived in the 8th century, and Isaiah wrote a book, 66 chapters, and it's still simply filled with the references, is simply filled with references to the one who's going to come, and redeem Israel. But he wouldn't only come and redeem Israel, he would also redeem the Gentiles. He would be the light of God, salvation to the ends of the earth. He would be born of a virgin. He would be born, in Isaiah 7:14, he would appear in the area which in that day was devastated by the Assyrian king Tiglath-Pileser III. And it was all death and destruction, and that day would come when a great light would shine in that region. In Isaiah 9:1 and 2, Isaiah also said this amazing statement, "Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting, Father, Prince of Peace." This child that's going to be born, this is who he is. Wonderful, Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting, Father, Prince of Peace. And in Isaiah 53, Isaiah told in as much detail as he could have been told of the redemptive work that this great one would accomplish. Though he would be mighty God, he would also die. He would die as a sacrifice. Though he would be considered as dying under the hand of God, yet that was not the case. He gave himself a sacrifice. And this was pleasing to God because by that sacrifice that this one would give, God would be able to forgive the world of its sins. And there were other prophets, such as Micah, who said, "But now Bethlehem, after those that weren't little to be numbered among the thousands of Judah, out of these shall one come forth to be a ruler in Israel, whose going forth are from of old, from everlasting." And on these great prophets spoke of this one who was coming. And when the captivity came, the captivity of Assyria ended the existence of Israel in the north. And the Babylonian captivity ended the existence of Judah in the south. And we have some of the great prophets that lived during that time, such as Daniel. And in the time of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar, who was king of Babylon, had a dream of a great image. And that image had a head of gold, and the chest and shoulders of silver, the abdomen and upper thighs of bronze, The legs of iron and the feet were of iron and clay mixed. And Nebuchadnezzar saw this vision, and it was interpreted to him by Daniel. And Daniel narrates exactly what he sees, that there was a stone cut out of a mountain without hands, and the stone came and smote the image in the feet, and the entire image collapsed. And then the pieces were blown away like chaff by the wind. And the interpretation of it was that there are 4 empires, beginning with Nebuchadnezzar as the head of gold, and there would be other empires, the Persian coming next, and the Grecian Empire, and the Roman Empire. And in Daniel 2:44, Daniel says, "And in the days of those kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these other kingdoms." As the years go by, the captivity ends and the children of Israel returns home. A remnant returns, and they are given an opportunity that they come back and start building. The people return and build, but the temple they're building doesn't look like it's going to be much of a temple, that it doesn't compare with the temple of Solomon's days that he had built. And there were those who shouted for joy, but there were also those who wept, so that they remembered the first temple. They remembered the temple that Solomon had built, and their hearts were broken as they considered the fallen fortunes of Israel. But God says to them, "Do you see this foundation, this temple? You don't think there's much to this. Well, let me tell you, the fact is that the glory of this house is going to be greater. The latter glory of this house is going to be greater than the former. Why, the day is going to come, God says, when the house that I'm building is going to be greater by far than the house that Solomon built." And when God said that he was not talking about this literal temple that they were building here at this return, in God's own mind, he was looking to the time when the Christ would come. And Christ would be the one who would build that ultimate house of God. He would be the one who would build that ultimate temple of God. And that's what God was looking at in Haggai and Zechariah. And Zechariah says, "Despise not the day of small things." And he foretold us all also about the wonderful new spiritual kingdom of the Messiah that God would establish. But we come to the end of the Old Testament era, and Malachi prophesies. And Malachi says to Israel that God has given you every chance. Israel was called by God in the days of Abraham, their father, Abraham, who was separated out of all the earth and called to serve God. What a privilege given to Abraham, and through him to Israel. And here is is taken out of Egypt, that God ever went into a foreign country and took people out for himself like he did Israel. What a privilege they were given. But they had never measured up to what God had challenged them to do. They had never been the holy nation that God wanted them to be. They had never been the kingdom of priests that God wanted them to be. And therefore in Malachi, God indicts them of all the sins and the failures that they're guilty of. And he makes the point that you say, where is the God of justice? Well, the God of justice is on his way. The God of justice is on his way. He is coming, and his messenger will go before him. And so the book of Malachi, we find the promises spoken regarding the coming of the Christ. And so Malachi is sort of the epitaph of the Old Testament. It's not only, we're told that this messenger, there's going to be one who's going to go before the one that everyone is expecting. There's one that's coming that we're looking at, the one that's coming throughout the whole Old Testament. And he was to have a messenger that would go before him and prepare his coming, to prepare for his coming. And then he would come, and the messenger of the covenant, now this is the Christ. The messenger of the covenant, this would be the God of justice, who would come, and they are wanting the God of justice. So it's not going to be what you think. When he shows up, when he comes, you will be able to stand before him. While he will be like the fuller, it will bleach the stain out. He will be like the refining fire that will burn all the impurities out of the order. Yes, he's coming back, but it's not going to be like you think. It is going to be for judgment and for purging. And when he says before that the great and terrible day of the Lord comes, that day when the judgment of God will come upon the earth, Elijah is going to come, and he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers. And this, of course, was a prophecy of the forerunner of Jesus, spoken of not only in Malachi, but also in Isaiah, and spoken of in verse 4, 5, and 6 of chapter 40. Yeah, he's coming, and Malachi closes. He hasn't gotten here yet. He hasn't arrived yet, but 400 years go by without a prophet, without a spokesman from God. It's the years of silence. But when those years are over, we come to the time referred to in Galatians 4:4. In the fullness of the time, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, that he might redeem them that are under the law. Jesus came, the one who was coming. He was coming, and we've only looked at the hem of the garment to see the evidence that is there, that it was spoken of this one who was coming. And now it is time, and the angel begins to appear to Zacharias and to Mary and to Joseph. And when Zacharias, the father of John, speaks at the birth of his son, when Mary speaks in her visit to Elizabeth, and all of these speeches and all these conversations, there is very heavy reference to all the prophecies and promises that God has been speaking of in the Old Testament. Because God wanted everyone concerned here to know that I am bringing my plan to pass. This is God at the hearing. I want you to know that. And so his hand was very, very prominent in all of this. And the angel and the other people inspired. They constantly referred back to these promises that were made in the Old Testament. And so Jesus was born. He was born of a virgin by the power of God, and the Holy Spirit caused that conception. It never had happened before, and it will never happen again. It happened this one time because it was in this means that this great sign that was given to the house of David would be accomplished, that the virgin would give birth to a son, Isaiah 7:14, the sign given to the house of David. And this is also the way that God accomplished the miracle and the wondrous things referred to in John 1:14. The Word became flesh, the Word which was God became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, glory out of the only begotten from the Father, full of grace and truth. Jesus lived upon this earth for 33 years, and a little more, the first 30 years of his life were obscure. But at the end of the 30 years of preparation, Jesus burst forth on the world just like that light that Isaiah had foretold in Isaiah 9. I took note of him, and the world has taken note of him ever since. You think how many, many thousands of people have been saved because he came. But there's another thing, while we marvel at his love and his grace and the salvation that he brought, there's another question to consider: how many people have actually not been judged yet, but they will be judged by him. All men will be judged by him. But there will be some who are judged unto condemnation. And it's this one who not only came to save, but he also came to be the judge. And during this time upon earth, the Son of Man came not to judge or condemn, but to save. But that was during his personal ministry, and he returned to heaven. He returned as the king. He returned as the king. He returned as the judge. And into his hand has been given life and death, and into his hand has been given all rule and all authority, all power, all dominion, and he rules over everything in heaven, upon the earth, and under the earth. And all these things have been subjected under him for strength. And the only thing that is not subject unto him is the one who subjected all things unto him, is the Father. Everything else is in his rule and his power. And this is the Messiah. This is the cross. This is the one who came. And he came and fulfilled the promises, and he fulfilled the promises in the end. All right. Thank y'all for your attention.